This is the talk I gave last week in June for the book launch of Rise and Fall of American Europe, with replies by Russ Muirhead and Chris Brooke.
You may have come across Glyn. He was a regular columnist in the London Review of Books, and if you haven't read anything by him, I strongly recommend you take a look at his article about the British royal family entitled "About as Useful as a String Condom." And, it's a brilliant article about the royal family. Fortunately, his brother Adam is here, so I wanted to dedicate the book to Glyn. I'm really happy that Adam could be here to pick it up. And there's a couple other people I'd like to thank. Simon Nixon wrote a fabulous review of it in the Financial Times. I'm very grateful to Simon, and I'm especially grateful to Davor and Gillian, who hosted me for the last 2 weeks, which, as a number of you here are former roommates of mine, know that hosting me is unendurable hell. But Davor's not. Thank you, Davor. So, welcome. I thought, what we're going to do, I'll give a very brief 5-minute overview of the book, and these guys are going to respond. I'll introduce them in a minute. If you haven't read the book, here's the argument. We've all been used to the idea that the post-war order began in 1945 when the United States established these institutions, and we've lived under this institutional regime. It's sometimes called the Atlantic Alliance, sometimes given a fancier name, the Pax Americana. And I've written a book which has argued that is all wrong. Historians have got everything wrong. And the post-war order really begins off the coast of Newfoundland in 1941, when Winston Churchill and FDR meet, and Winston Churchill begs the Americans to come to the assistance of Britain. They're alone battling Nazi Germany. And we're told that Americans, out of the goodness of their heart, decide they will help Britain out. Wrong! The Americans sign something with the British called the Atlantic Charter, and the Atlantic Charter is essentially a death warrant for the British Empire. Americans say that they will help Britain, but Britain will have to give up its empire. They also ask Britain, as a guarantee of any money that they give, that they will have to guarantee a number of paintings from the National Gallery. They will have to give up the Magna Carta, so they can go to Congress and say this is what the British are doing to guarantee the loan. It's a fairly aggressive transactional relationship from the United States, and it's always been that way. But in 1941, I think we see the start of something called American Europe. American Europe is a particular type of state form, as I call it, a particular type of political entity, and it's really a political entity that is guaranteed by American security. American security provides the basis of the post-war order, and Europeans, British people too, are in a state of denial about the extent to which they are dependent upon the United States. I think it's harder to sustain that state of denial in the wake of the Ukraine war, a fierce war being waged on the borders of Europe, when the negotiations for the settlement of this war have the United States talking to the Russians, and the Europeans are not even in the room. Evidence of just how dependent the British and the Europeans are. This post-war order, as I argue, starts in 1941. It ends July 25th, 2025. And it ends in the Trump-Turnberry golf course. The Trump-Turnberry golf course sees the European statesmen, leaders, led by Ursula von der Leyen, where they have to try to persuade Trump not to impose a very punitive trade regime with high tariffs. And Europe has always prided itself on just how strong it is in the trade world. I mean, Europeans will tell you, we're not strong militarily, we're not strong in security terms, but we are really strong when it comes to trade. When it comes to trade, we can stand up against the United States. We can go toe-to-toe We've had tremendous success in trade deals. We, in the 2000s, alone persuaded the Americans they couldn't merge Honeywell and General Electric. We got Microsoft to break up its browser. We are an incredible trade superpower. Wrong, because Donald Trump said, if you don't bow to us on the trade deal, we're pulling out of security. You're going to be by yourself against Ukraine. And the Europeans collapse. The Europeans have to give in, and there's a very famous photograph, the Financial Times had it, a lot of the newspapers had it, with Donald Trump with his idiot grin going like this, Ursula von der Leyen standing next to him with an idiot grin, and over in the corner, there's a lady called Sabine Weyand, who is the European Trade Minister, and she knows what's just happened, and she's glowering. She looks like she's about to commit suicide over this deal they've just struck. American Europe, as I call it, comes to an end in July 2025. This regime now is broken down, and the Americans want to impose a new regime on Europe. And I call this new regime civilizational America. This new regime is going to be much harsher. It's going to be much more transactional. We see evidence of it appearing in things like J.D. Vance's Munich speech. Remember what he says, the Europeans are an embarrassment, they're weak, they've got ridiculous laws about free speech, they've lost control of their borders, they're woke, they've got diversity run amok, and we're going to whip them into shape. And J.D. Vance and Rubio and a number of other people and the right-wing blogosphere has been going on and on. London figures very prominently in the right-wing blogosphere. London is a hell on earth for the right-wing. This is what happens if you let woke people take over. And so Europe gets sucked into what I think of as a cultural war between the right and the far right and the less right. There's no real left in America. And Europe figures as the place that Republicans and MAGA don't want to go. And because of that, Europe is going to be under enormous amounts of pressure to adopt a much more pro-friendly culture, a much more pro-American way of life. And where does that leave Europe? I come to the end here, and unfortunately, much to the horror of the publishers, they kept saying, can't you end on a happy note? And I kept saying, there isn't one.
Have you met me?
Europe has three options. One option is what I call happy vassals. So Europeans simply say, we're going to be under the thumb of America, but we just have to get over it. We're going to do what they want. And if they want to charge us 20% on trade tariffs, if they want us to put more money into security, there's nothing we can do about it. We just have to put up with it. We'll be happy vassals. We'll continue our nice work-life balance, but we won't try and become great powers anymore. One option. Second option is the strategy favoured by the European right. That is to say, we're going to go back to a Europe of nation states. We're going to follow the model that Viktor Orban started to develop in Hungary. And each individual European nation state is going to strike its own separate deals, some with America, some with Russia, some with China. Second option. The third option, which is the one I favour, but I fully concede it is extremely unlikely, is that Europe as a trade entity and Europe as a security entity have to converge. I don't know how they will converge. I called it UTO. I mean, so it's either the European Union assume control of security, or a post-NATO security alliance also assumes control of trade. But Europe's only future, and I include Britain in this, I don't think Britain can work as a separate nation state, is that Europe comes together as a unified political, trade, and security arrangement. Very unlikely. So if that's unlikely, it's the happy vassal or Europe nation state. I conclude, you guys are screwed. You can disagree with me, you can ask questions, or you can think about things. Why don't we just turn things over to my American colleague, Professor Russ Muirhead. He and I met him. He and I were the junior political philosophers at Harvard University. We would gather at the end of the day to lament how badly we've been treated by the senior faculty and how the graduate students had no respect for us, and we would drown our sorrows. He is now a professor of government at Dartmouth College, and more than that, he is a real-life politician. He's a senator in the New Hampshire Senate. He knows more about the way politics works than almost anyone. And he's an American patriot. And he sometimes gets very angry with me when I criticize America. So he's going to do his best to rescue America from the awful things I have had to say about it in the book.
I mean, I think there's a sort of hope among. I serve as a Democrat in a legislature, in the New Hampshire state legislature. There's a hope in my party, of course, that the world will be set right in 2028 when a Democrat is restored to the presidency. And I think that there's a hope among, in the enlightened corners of European opinion and even British opinion, that all can be made well with a restoration of sanity to the White House, and that American Europe can be restored. And that this will all be a temporary and bad dream. And I think that actually the transformation of Trumpism is likely to be much more permanent than that. And that the best way to combat it is not with a moral argument, but with an interest-based, realist argument. One of the things that this book shows that I think was, for me, something new, was that American Europe was founded because of the selfish interests of the United States, as it understood those interests in the 1940s and 50s and imposed them on Great Britain and the continent. And it's tempting to read American Europe as a values-based project, as a rules-based liberal order, motivated by moral conceptions, as an example of kind of the Hegelian spirit of reason, working itself out in history, as an advance, as an instance of progress, as we move from a more force-based world to a more respectful, rules-based, rule of law world. And what we see in Glyn's book is that it wasn't these moral convictions that caused the United States to kind of create and impose this order. It was a very concrete sense of the material interests of the United States of America and how those could be served. And also the strategic interests of the United States of America and how they could be served, both through NATO and eventually through the European Union. And I think to defend American Europe requires that kind of realist sensibility. What's happening in America right now is actually a moral project. Trumpism is a moral project. And it's a moral project that is sacrificing the economic and security interests of the United States of America. The problem with it isn't just that it's wrong from a moral perspective. It is, of course, troubling, I think, from that perspective. But the real problem is that it's making America less prosperous and less secure. And it's permanently damaging, you wanted the perspective of the United States, it's permanently damaging the long-run interests of the United States of America. And the destruction of American Europe is also bad, I think, for the interests of the United States of America, not to mention the interests of Europe. So I think a realist argument is the best way to, we're not going to restore it, but to recreate some semblance of it, or maybe refound it on a new basis. There are four major policy reversals going on in the United States of America. Many people say that Trump has no interest in policy. He does want to destroy the policy state. There's something willful, arbitrary, and chaotic about the kind of personal rule that Trump represents. But what we're seeing is a startling reversal of 50 to 75 years of consistent policy trajectories on immigration, Since 1965, the United States has had a very liberal immigration policy. We've seen a forthright reversal of that, and probably a permanent reversal of that, or a long-lasting reversal of that, from liberal policies from 1965 to 2024. On trade, we had 70 years of consistent trade liberalization. And now, tariffs. I don't think we're going to undo those tariffs because they're generating hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue for the United States government. That's trillions of dollars in deficit every year. So I think the tariffs and immigration reversals are going to stick. The third great reversal is on civil rights. What we saw from 1948, when Truman racially integrates the armed forces, until 2020, when Joe Biden says that transsexual rights are the civil rights cause of the 21st century. What we see is moving from equal rights for blacks to equal rights for women to equal rights for homosexuals and gay couples, for instance, to marry, to equal rights for transsexuals. See a consistent trajectory toward greater equality, and that's forthrightly and decisively reversed. If you read Trump's executive order on transsexuality, it's not like a prudent reversal as the idea of transsexual rights are applied to complicated cases like youth sports. It's a complete reversal of the idea that people should be equals under the law, and it's filled with venom for this category of people, and it authorizes and legalizes and makes respectable that venom. So it's a completely moral project in every one of these domains. And the fourth one is the reversal of American Europe, the destruction of American Europe. Also, as you describe it in the book, a very moral project, because Europe represents the permissiveness, the post-Christian permissiveness that terrifies the American right. And so filled with hostility for European culture, it wants to destroy the military and economic alliances, political alliances that have made these places prosperous and secure. And so we're looking at a moral project that's making us poorer and less safe. And the right way to argue against that, there's no reason not to make moral arguments. Why not make them? But the more, I think, powerful arguments will be material. We have to argue for the alliance and argue for instance, trade on the basis of prosperity and security. And that's what gave rise to American Europe, and that's what might save it.
On my left, both spatially and ideologically, is Chris Brooke, another friend from my Harvard days. He is now teaches at the University of Cambridge. He's one of the leading historians of political thought and a man of enormous erudition. But more than that, every Sunday morning, he runs on Facebook something called Chat, with an exclamation mark. And Chat consists of about, how many, 500 people?
Not nearly that many.
A few hundred people who discuss novels, films, and politics. And I've learned enormously from this. Not only that, every year he runs a competition to predict what's going to happen in the following year. It's an extremely competitive competition, and the award winner is called, what is he called?
Paul the Octopus.
Paul the Octopus Memorial. Fortunately, the current winner of the competition is here. Thank you.
So we're here to celebrate the publication of Glyn's excellent new book on the rise and fall of American Europe. My difficulty in talking about it is that it's very much a story of the last 80 years, and I work on the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, because I find the 20th century really difficult, so I tend to avoid it. So what I'm going to do in these remarks is I'm going to sketch a prehistory of Glyn's American Europe, because it seems to me that there's an interesting story that begins long before Woodrow Wilson and the 14 Points and the Paris Peace Conference, that perhaps helps us understand the significance of what Glyn is doing. Because I'm going to suggest at the end of these remarks that what he's doing is he's offering a reply, and he's offering quite a powerful reply, to a challenge, to a gauntlet that's thrown down by Rosa Luxemburg in the world of intramural socialist polemic in Germany in 1911. The best known proponent of the European Union prior to the 20th century was probably the Abbé de Saint-Pierre with his plan for perpetual peace. Now, if you study international relations, and we have at least one person here who does, you'll learn about the balance of power that's supposed to have regulated European politics in the eras of the Treaty of Westphalia after 1648 and the Treaty of Utrecht after 1713. But the balance of power always had its critics, and one of them was Saint-Pierre, who called it significantly the system of war. If we wanted to move from the politically disastrous world characterized by the wars of Louis XIV in the late 17th and early 18th century, Saint-Pierre argued, it would be through a European federation, whose headquarters would be based in the Low Countries, not in Brussels, but in Utrecht, which would regulate international disagreements through the votes of a central council in which all the member states were represented. Now, if we move from Saint-Pierre's 18th century into the 19th century, any number of political movements are basically the descendants, following in Saint-Pierre's footsteps, whether liberal, republican, democratic, socialist, pacifist, anarchist, communist, Quaker, or whatever. It just seems obvious to a lot of people on what we might call the left-hand side of the political spectrum that if the future was going to be less blood-soaked than the past, there would have to be a lot more international coordination, cooperation, harmonization, federation, and so on. The big shift is that in the 19th century, people are critical of Saint-Pierre because they thought he was arguing for a league of kings, and from the 19th century, these people are invested in the idea of a federation of peoples, a more democratic understanding of what was going on. Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Immanuel Kant in the 18th century both made a version of this move, that Pacific international federation required the constitutionalization and the republicanization, and these days we would say the democratization of Europe's monarchies. But something like this view became the common sense of the 19th century left. Then as now, there were always critics who thought that these were ultimately naive political fantasies, and that was Saint-Pierre's reputation in the 18th century. And one of the interesting trends in the discussion is the emergence of a realization, especially in France, that begins to appreciate that European federation doesn't really transcend the international balance of power. It displaces it and it reinscribes it on the level, on an ever larger and ever more potentially destructive level. So that instead of rivalry between the King of France and the King of Britain, or France and Germany suspiciously eyeing each other over the River Rhine, you end up with transcontinental rivalries involving especially Europe and America, and then usually some East Asian power, although in the different accounts sometimes it's a Chinese state and sometimes it's a Japanese state that's imagined as the regional superpower. This, by the way, is connected to the world of the deranged racism around the Yellow Peril in the late 19th century. We're probably most familiar with this kind of political macro-geography through George Orwell's novel, 1984, which has Eurasia, East Asia, and Oceania, of course, regularly swapping alliances in order to shift the focus of hostility between East Asia and Eurasia, which of course is exactly what classic balance of power theory predicts. But we know Orwell and we've forgotten the other ones, but there was a huge amount of this speculation about the reorganization of world politics along massive power block lines in the first half of the 20th century. So alongside this left-wing idealization of what increasingly across the 19th century became called the United States of Europe, there's another set of arguments, often coming from political economists, about how European Union was a kind of realpolitik response to the changing dynamics of international politics. So following the Napoleonic Wars, there's this German aristocrat called Konrad von Schmidt-Fizzldeck, no reason why any of you should have heard of him, who'd been the director of the Danish National Bank. And he argues that Europe risks being squeezed between the two rising powers, Russia to its east, America to its west. And in particular, he's worried that America will soon be self-sufficient economically, or the Americas will soon be self-sufficient economically, and that will affect the balance of trade, the terms of trade with Europe. And in the context of the European debt crisis, will make things worse. And so Schmidt-Wieseldeck recommends the formation of what he calls a Europäischer Bund, a European Union, as a way of coordinating a large-scale economic response to the rise of American mercantilist power. And there's a German tradition of economics associated above all with the figure of Friedrich List, thinking about the Zollverein, the customs union in Germany, that's also interested in thinking about this kind of large-scale economic coordination. There are two moments in the later 19th century where plenty of economists, especially but not only in France and Germany, write about a European customs union. In 1879, when Bismarck produces his new tariff policy, the so-called marriage of iron and rye, and then again and more intensively in 1890, when the Americans introduce tariffs, following first Representative William McKinley, who later becomes President McKinley. Trump idolizes McKinley because he was the real tariff man. These were proposals for customs unions, though, in Europe, that required Franco-German cooperation, and that absolutely wasn't happening in the last third of the 19th century, because of the seething French resentment over the German annexation of Alsace and Lorraine in 1871. And from this long-term perspective, it's not at all surprising that it's when the question of the Franco-German frontier is finally settled after the Second World War that moves towards European Union happen very rapidly. Well, finally, in 1911, there's a punchy exchange between two of the leading German socialists, Karl Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg. Luxemburg is Polish, but she's operating in a German language, German environment. Around May Day 1911, Kautsky published an article arguing a bit like these latter-day disciples of Verbe de Saint-Pierre, arguing that the road to socialism went through the United States of Europe, partly through a taxpayers' revolt over the increasing costs of European militarism, partly as a humanitarian revolt against war itself. What the cantons of Switzerland are today, Kautsky wrote, the present nations will be of the socialist commonwealth of the states of the future. And Rosa Luxemburg's counterblast, in the tradition of Saint-Pierre's realpolitik critics, was to say that this was a lazy and a dangerous way to present things, and that in the context of modern capitalist imperialism, a united Europe, and these are her words, can objectively, in the economic sense, mean only a tariff war with America, and in the political sense, only a colonial race war. And although this isn't how Glyn puts things in his, to repeat, excellent book, in a way, I think what he's doing is he's offering a reply to what I'm calling Rosa Luxemburg's challenge. Let's say that you wanted a united Europe in the context of 20th century capitalism, but you didn't want either a tariff war with America or a colonial race war, then what would that look like? And Glyn's answer comes in two words. It will look like American Europe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is it too soon to talk about July 2025 as history? And all the learnings you get are the longer you wait, the better your perspective becomes to some extent.
Yeah.
So this picture of a mercantilist America in this new form, and then your colleague on your right talked about this isn't here temporarily, it's here permanently, the change.
Yeah.
But can't that all be unpicked? Can't we go back to American Europe? Won't we go back? And how do we even know whether you're right or not?
That's the Russ.
I think that that there are two reasons to think that we're not going back, and one is that neither the right nor the left in the United States right now has has a deep commitment to American Europe. And I think that there's a widespread sense that American Europe, in the US, that American Europe is exploitative, that America is being exploited by Europe, that American taxpayers are subsidizing European social welfare states by paying for the defense of Europe. And so that's what I mean. If you want to strengthen the ethos of American Europe, much less reconstruct something like it, you have to make an argument to Americans about why it's in their interest. And the real tragedy here is that it is in their interest. Exactly how the costs are apportioned, whether states in Europe spend 2.5% of GDP or 3 or 3.2%, that's not really where the action is. And those problems can be solved. They are not easy, but they can be solved. But neither party, no elites in the United States have made a convincing case to American citizens for the last 40 years that this is in their strategic interest. And that's the kind of, you need to cultivate a public understanding of our alliance with Europe as something that's strategically beneficial and not just motivated by a love of liberal rules-based orders.
Is your party trying to describe that gain that can be re-achieved? I mean, would Obama be part of that description? Where's the noise coming from the Democrats? I hear nothing.
Exactly. So that's my concern, is that in fact what we see, I think, for instance, it's going to be very hard for the Democratic Party to win the presidency without mimicking finding someone who can emulate the demagogic power of Trump, and to some extent Vance. And I think that sort of leader is not going to just have this kind of instinct that we need to go back. I mean, Biden just had a set of instincts, and there was a kind of path dependence in the commitment to American Europe that oriented the Obama administration and even the Clinton administration after the fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War. Now we need to resurrect a deep understanding of why it's in the interest of the United States, and you need leaders in the Democratic Party who can do that, strategic leaders who argue this. I mean, I think the argument, you mentioned Rich Colby in the book, that really underneath this too is this idea that Russia's not really, the remnants of the Soviet Union are not really the enemy of the United States, not something the United States must worry about. It's really China. So all the expense associated with NATO is not an expense that's really defending the country against its fundamental strategic foe. And so again, I think you need to. It's an error to think that the United States doesn't need to worry about Russia and only needs to worry about China and can cut loose from Europe. It's a strategic error, but the argument needs to be made by a new generation. I don't see it coming from AOC.
Nigel.
Yes, I'm one of those housemates of Glyn's.
We're not talking about that, Nigel.
Come to me afterwards, and that's the story. So, I mean, it's worth just bearing in mind that the transatlantic alliance is a very weird and historically anomalous alliance. So 80 years old, even longer if you date it from 1941, and separated by an ocean. It's a remarkable achievement that it's been sustained for so long. So inevitably, as the wider geopolitical and geoeconomic environment shifts in profound ways, and the members of this alliance change in various ways, of course it will come under strain. But in the spirit of the first question, I suggest that, in the spirit of the Terminator, the future is not set at all. This is a very fluid moment, and the coming 3 or 4 years will be fluid, for at least 2 reasons. One is, MAGA itself is not a well-defined, coherent project. It's a coalition, and to some degree a coalition of convenience between different groups with different interests and different ideas. Yes, there's a moral element, as you say, Russ, but I wouldn't overplay that. There are lots of other things going on as well. It's about the interests of those who believe that free trade has made them losers, actually. There's nothing irrational, if you take that point of view, from wanting to put up tariff walls. And there's more specifically even than that, the frankly plutocratic and personalistic interests of Trump and those around him, who are using foreign policy as an arm of their personal aggrandizement. And finally, there are the tech bros, of course, who want more openness and more access and more flows across the board. There's lots of tensions here, and it's not clear at all that that will prove stable. even the people closest to Trump, there's profound differences of view between the gilded mediocrity Elbridge Colby, the weird J.D. Vance, frankly, and who would have thought it, the grown-up in the room, Marco Rubio, or even Scott Bessent, an orthodox Wall Street banker. Lots of differences. That's the first reason. The instability, that is something to watch. The second reason is that it's even less clear that MAGA, however defined in all of its underlying tensions, ambiguities, is actually very popular in the country as a whole. Look at Trump's ratings now. And there are all sorts of quiet anxiety. Don't worry, I'll finish in a moment, Glyn. All sorts of quiet anxieties among the grown-ups in the Republican Party who would be very happy, they're too frightened to constrain him now, very happy if their party was restored to not exactly the same as past, but something closer to it. So again, MAGA is a contradictory project, and it's not clear that it commands the country.
Can I just say two quick things before Russ answers those difficult questions? One, Nigel is a former British ambassador, and is testimony to the high quality of the British foreign service.
It is.
Secondly, Russ and I have recently signed a contract to write a book called MAGA Meets Madison, which is about what feature of the MAGA ideology could get through this constitutional system and which features of the ideology couldn't.
I really appreciate that observation about the fluidity of the moment. And I also am struck by that, and I do share that. It's another way of saying it's a very disorienting moment. It's hard to know what's happening right in front of our eyes, and that makes it also very difficult to predict anything. And things that the old order is crumbling, and it's not at all clear that any kind of new order can be reconstructed, and much less what it might be. As far as the unusualness of the alliance, I mean, I think if we were to ask an historian, Chris, what do you think? What's the modal number of alliances that countries of the world have had over the last 3 centuries? And my guess is that the answer is 0. The most common integer that you'd find is 0. And so to have a country like the United States with 70 allies, many of whom are the best allies that any nation has ever had in the history of politics, such as Canada, and to willfully and wantonly destroy that alliance for no purpose whatsoever is astonishing. So I mean, what's being destroyed is very, very hard to replace. And it's much more likely that we'll get a world in which the United States has no allies. So I think there is something not just fluid but destructive, and one of the things that I think underlines the fluidity and instability is just how impossible it's been in the United States and Britain in recent years to form a durable governing majority. I was amazed by the UK electoral system 2 years ago when an electoral vote of about 37% produced an amazing parliamentary majority where the governing party could do anything it wants for 60 months, and if they happen to have some good luck along the way, they can renew the clock, start the clock over again. From an American point of view, this is astonishing. But here we are 2 years later, and the government's crumbling. And in the United States, no party's been able to form a durable governing majority. No party's been able to reliably elect itself, get majorities in the House of Representatives, the Senate, and elect presidents for more than 2 years. Each party has had 3 chances to unify the United States government since about 1990. The Democratic Party had a chance in 92, lasted for 2 years, had a chance in 2012, lasted in 2008, lasted for 2 years. 2016, it lasted for 2 years. The Republican Party had a chance in 2002, under Bush. It had a chance under Trump in 2016. I might be getting my years wrong. It had a chance in 2024, and it's going to lose it in November. So neither party can consolidate the government. When you say that MAGA is a chaotic coalition, and it lacks a kind of coherent, embrace of a policy program, and it lacks, even beyond a policy program, a kind of public philosophy that generates durable and widespread allegiance, I think you're right. I don't think it's going to create a durable governing majority that unifies the American government for a generation. it's going to probably be ruptured in less than 6 months. And in this time of very, very insecure majorities and very insecure governments, it's all the more difficult to sort of recreate the kinds of institutions that are essential to securing anything like a durable peace, much less a kind of mutually beneficial trade.
I mean, I think to go back to the original question about, you know, how much time has to pass before we can start writing history, and obviously if Glyn focuses on something that happened on a Scottish golf course last July, we can think, well, that can be reversed just as quickly. But I think one of the strengths of this book is that it is a useful antidote to people who might be tempted to think we just have to wait for Trump to die or leave office, or then we re-elect Gavin Newsom in 2028 and then things get back to normal. Because I think Glyn does have this, I think he writes well about how that even absent Trump, the foundations of American Europe were under some strain, and that and there is a somewhat longer term historical perspective that gives us part of the sense of why, even if Trump leaves power sooner rather than later, even if the Democrats win convincingly in 2028, there's going to be nothing like a restoration of the status quo ante. Yeah. And I think in part that's because, you know, Glyn has a sneaking respect for some of the argument, which is that European elites have been free riding on the European willingness to fund their defense, the American willingness to fund their defense over the last 80 years. And those arguments about what defense spending should be, I mean, there is a real bite to them, which is that when American politicians say that Europeans must pay their way, they have a point. And no Democrat is going to say that we're going to go back to the past where Germany can be effectively demilitarized and Europeans can promise a tiny contribution to NATO budgets, which they then don't deliver. Yeah. That world is past, yes. And that's why what will come next, even on optimistic scenarios, won't look anything like American Europe.
You know, I bet if you did a poll of the American public and asked them whether America has permanent military bases in Germany and Japan, most people would deny it. I don't think that among most citizens there's even an appreciation of what American Europe is institutionally.
Well, you could do a poll in Britain and ask them whether Britain has an independent nuclear weapon
capacity, yeah, and they'd say yes.
They would say yes. Why don't we just stop there?
One more.
One more. Okay.
Sorry, I was just going to say this particularly to Russ, but what if this revulsion among the American elites of both parties towards the continuation of an American Europe is actually, perhaps not in all respects, but in some respects and some quite fundamental ones, correct? What if they are actually right, that the way particularly that things have been continued since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Warsaw Pact, have indeed left European states and their governments living in a sort of fool's paradise, and isn't it actually the case that the results of this over the last, certainly since 2001, have been extremely unhealthy for European states, I would argue, and some European states, particularly Britain, more than others, in that, for example, the United Kingdom was forced into an absolutely ridiculous military campaign in Iraq. There was an alliance war in Afghanistan, which was very deeply mismanaged. There was finally the resurgence of an aggressive militaristic Russia, and the European response from 2014 until 2022, and indeed before 2014, and indeed to some extent after 2022, has been incoherent and inadequate. And if these movements, this revulsion among both the American electorate and the American elites against what came before, are forcing the end, in some ways, of this American Europe, that actually, for Europe and for the United Kingdom, is potentially an extremely good thing.
I mean, it had been for 3,000 deaths, we could probably call the decision to bomb Iran, comically catastrophic. But as such, we can still call it catastrophic. And yet, the catastrophe of that pales in comparison to the catastrophe of March 2003, when the United States and the coalition invade Baghdad, invade Iraq. And I think you're right that the American Europe is an elite-led project. It's conceived by elites, it's negotiated by elites, hammered out, it's institutionalized and sustained, as it must be in politics, by elites. Most people who are trying to who run out of money on the 27th day of the month, who are figuring out how to get their budget balanced, who are trying to pay the bills and take care of their discharge their personal responsibilities, are not thinking about foreign policy. And so if you're thinking in any serious and sustained way about foreign policy, you're in an elite. And Americans trusted their elites with respect to American Europe. And it's impossible to overstate how much the Iraq War undercut and I think permanently destroyed this trust. Trumpism is a response to the failure of elites, and not just Republican Party elites, elites across the political spectrum and on both sides that bestrided the Atlantic in that engagement. And we saw, in 2016, when Trump is running for president, he refers to the Iraq invasion as a catastrophe in one of the Republican debates. Carly Fiorina says, "You can't say that, we're Republicans." And he said, "Well, I'm saying it." And he's the only Republican who's willing to call it a catastrophe. Jeb Bush was the heir apparent. He should have gotten the nomination. He had all the money in the world. He had name recognition. He had experience. He had been multi-term governor of Florida, one of the largest, most vital states in the country, and son and brother of a president. And he got nowhere because when they asked him what he thought about Iraq, he didn't know how to answer the question. So the elites are caught with their trousers down. And worse than that,
We say pants.
Oh, do you say it? Really?
We Americans.
And they not just embarrassed themselves, they betrayed the country. And I think that's a huge reason, not only for Trumpism, but I think for the loss of faith in American Europe among ordinary voters and leaders trying to get their votes.
Thank you.